Tonight on Primetime, Britain and France say they're prepared to deploy troops to keep the peace in Ukraine, but only after a peace agreement is in place. European allies unite in Paris for another meeting between the so-called coalition of the willing, while Washington signals backing for binding guarantees aimed at deterring any future Russian attack. Is talk then finally turning into action? Good evening. The UK and France say they are ready to send troops into Ukraine once a peace deal is agreed. A clear signal that Europe is preparing for what comes after a ceasefire. Well, that message emerged from a Paris meeting of the coalition of the willing, where the United States, for the first time, backed binding security guarantees designed to protect Ukraine if Russia were to strike again. Well, leaders agreed any settlement must be underpinned by firm commitments, not political assurances. Our correspondent Ross Cullen reports now from Paris.
The United States, for the first time, has backed a broad coalition of Ukraine's allies in vowing to provide security guarantees that leaders said would include binding commitments to support the country if Russia attacks again. Tuesday's pledge came at a summit in Paris of the coalition of the willing, of mainly European nations, to firm up guarantees to reassure Kyiv in the event of a ceasefire with Russia. Leaders agreed that any peace deal must include strong and binding commitments.
There were agreements on security guarantees for Ukraine, that the United States would help monitor any ceasefire once that is put into place. Also, the deployment of European troops. And specifically on that, before the closing news conference, there was a signing of a declaration of intent by the UK, France and Ukraine that Britain and France would deploy troops inside Ukraine after any peace deal is signed.
French President Emmanuel Macron said the agreement marked a significant step and would help deter further aggression against Ukraine. He added that US support for the security guarantees under a peace deal is credible and reliable. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff says the security protocols are as strong as anyone has ever seen.
We think we're largely finished with security protocols, which are important so that the people of Ukraine know that when this ends, it ends forever. But we also think, critically, that we are very, very close to finishing up as robust a prosperity agreement as any country has ever seen coming out of conflicts like this.
The allies also agreed to establish a US-Ukraine coalition coordination cell in Paris. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the outcome of the Paris talks, calling the declaration substantive. Meanwhile, Moscow has given no public sign that it would accept a peace deal with the security guarantees envisaged by Ukraine's allies. Russia has previously rejected any NATO members having troops inside Ukraine.
Okay, joining me now is Chip Chapman, a former senior British Army officer and military strategist with extensive experience in defence planning, conflict law and rules of engagement. Mr. Chapman, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Prime Time. I've got a list here in front of me of these coalition of the willing meetings. I have to say it's very extensive. If you only count the highest level gatherings, that still comes to 12 since March 2025. You know, if you ignore all the smaller meetings, the planning conversations, it's an incredibly long amount of time for leaders to be together, essentially talking, isn't it? But has it actually achieved anything tangibly so far?
Well, there's no such thing as a quick peace unless you have a decisive military victory. So, in terms of sequencing and time, it's actually not a long time. So, for example, the Ukraine contact group led to the Ramstein format, then the NATO format taking that over, and the prioritised Ukraine requirements list. It took actually 2 years and 500 meetings to unlock the Korean war in terms of an armistice, different than a ceasefire, and 5 years in Ukraine for the Paris Peace Accords. So it's not that long, and you need to get it right. Now, what this is obviously part of a unified security architecture with now three levels. The first being the defense by the Ukrainians with 800,000 troops, if that's what comes out. The second being the coalition of the willing and some boots on ground and support from 35 other allies, including European and international partners. And thirdly, the third tiered layer of the US. So that is significant. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we're going to have peace tomorrow. It doesn't mean we're going to have peace next week or next month. And I don't think that Russia will initially make any point of saying that they don't accept this or they do accept this. They will try and kick that can down the road to concentrate on what they see as the more substantive element to begin with, which is the territorial issues. They are unresolved.
Has the contribution of Europe to this process then shifted away from pushing for the ceasefire and to concentrating more on what happens after the ceasefire occurs?
No, I think both things happen at the same time. Now, of course, the European priority is a ceasefire and then negotiations. That is freezing the conflict at the moment at the line of contact. The Russian view to that is completely opposed, of course. It's negotiations leading to an agreement and then a ceasefire. So you can try and lever the elements which get you to a ceasefire at the same time as you must do the planning for what comes after a ceasefire. And that's, you could argue, one of the problems that they've had in the Middle East when they didn't have a force ready to go on the ground in Gaza when phase one of that occurred.
And in terms of describing, bringing to life what these troops and their day-to-day activities might look like, I mean, just help us with that. Is this going to be primarily about deterrence, with a certain degree of it being symbolic? Is it going to be about monitoring, or something a bit more robust?
Well, it can be all three things. So the first thing is it's supposed to be there to monitor a ceasefire, and you can do that both by physical means, being there with troops, or by technical means, surveillance by satellites or other means. The second one, in terms of the enforcement, is classical peacekeeping. Of course, has three parts: that you're there to monitor, but then you act only in self-defense. What we don't know, of course, is the intent has been established with the signing of this declaration. That is the what. And why and what they might respond to is a different thing, and that's contained in the rules of engagement. That is generally kept quite secretive, so I don't think we'd know that at all, and I don't think that would be put in open source information. But I think it is the deterrence thing which is absolutely the key to this. So after the Russian incursions in 2014, that was what led to the NATO doing the enhanced forward presence in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. British troops, for example, went to Estonia, Canadians and French into the other two that I mentioned in the Baltic, and the Americans into Poland. And deterrence is either by denial, that is being there, or by punishment. So there's an element of denial. By being there, you alter the calculus of the Russians, and by punishment, if you do something post-ceasefire, then we will respond to that.
And turning to Washington, as we've already mentioned, the US is backing binding security guarantees for the first time. Do you expect that to change the mindset, the strategy in the Kremlin in any way?
No, but I think the calculus for the Kremlin has been made more complicated by that, and also by what's been happening in the last day or two in Venezuela, where have been seen not to be. And I think the problem for Putin is that he doesn't want to annoy Trump, and at some stage he's going to run out of concessions. He doesn't seem to be in the viewpoint of doing that at the moment. He'll be called out by Trump if he doesn't do that soon, I suspect.
Yeah, President Putin has long rejected the idea of Western troops inside Ukraine, hasn't he? I mean, do you think he's likely to, in some sense, coalesce or find a way to coalesce on that?
Well, you'll have to. He's absolutely right what he said previously, that any Western troops who were in Ukraine at the moment would be a legitimate target. But that is when you're at a state of war. That is a difference when you're at a ceasefire and some sort of peace agreement. So it's okay to have the rhetoric about legitimate targets when you're in a conflict. It is not legitimate to say that when you're in a period of conflict termination. So he will have to change his rhetoric if he still wants to keep Trump on side. And as I said, I think that is the real dilemma for Trump, for Putin at the moment. And really, it comes back down to the Helsinki Commission, which is the American commission which looks at Russian-US relations. In September 24, that said that at some stage, Trump will see that Putin is not an honest interlocutor, and that he can't make deals with him. It is then that Trump may go to the sort of secondary sanctions and start being serious about things. There's of course only one thing that he's done since his period in office, which is the sanctions on two of the oil companies in October 25.
And finally, Mr. Chapman, do you think when we look back, when analysts look back in 12, 24 months' time, that what's taken place in Paris will be seen as some kind of turning point, will have some kind of significance attached to it?
Well, I would say both what happened in Venezuela and Paris might be seen as turning points. I think what it proves is that hard power is the way that the world is going at the moment. If Trump wants to use that hard power and use that as leverage over Putin, I don't think Putin will be able to resist that. But of course, the variables are still great in this. We don't know what the support from China will be, for example, and that is the biggest variable in terms of not wishing Russia to lose.
Mr. Chapman, we thank you very much indeed for joining us and for your very incisive analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break now. We'll be back very soon with more. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching PrimeTime. Britain and France have signalled readiness to deploy forces to Ukraine after any peace settlement, underlining Europe's focus on the post-ceasefire phase. At talks in Paris, Washington also endorsed binding security guarantees to deter any renewed Russian attack. Well, joining me now is Vlad Romino, a EU policy expert in Brussels. Mr. Marino, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It all looked pretty friendly, didn't it, after the meeting today? Lots of warm words and handshakes. Do you think, from a Brussels perspective, this meeting in Paris signals a more unified approach from the EU to Ukraine's long-term security?
It definitely means a commitment, and a clear commitment. It is not by coincidence that the meeting happened in Paris. I think France was, together with Germany, actually, a very clear supporter of an European commitment for the security of Ukraine. I think it does continue what started in Brussels, actually, with the many councils of the European Union discussions around Ukraine, around the security in Ukraine, around making the economic conditions right for Ukraine to be able to survive economically, but also to prepare for an eventual future accession to the EU. So I think it is a continuation of that. It happened in Paris again because the support of France and Germany was extremely important. And as we know, France took complementary, together with the United Kingdom, complementary engagements, including in what it is called the Coalition of the Willing. And let's not forget that both France and the United Kingdom are extremely respected and powerful military powers, and also the two military powers within Europe, not within the European Union. France is within, as we know, the UK post-Brexit is no longer there, but the two military powers, which also are military nuclear powers. So an important element in such a context to remind.
But both leaders, though, of those two countries are under tremendous pressure at home, aren't they, politically? How difficult do you think it's going to be, not just for Starmer and Macron, but for for all EU governments to turn these security guarantees into actual binding commitments, given that their own electorates may not be so happy to do so?
I think this is generally and the point that you raise is a very important one. You know, commitment is as good as it can be executed. And as a deterrence element, definitely, if you want to deter a foreign power, you need to make sure that your commitment is executable and it is credible. So, of course, there will be a test there on both cases. But I think in many countries of the EU, political leaders will have very similar issues. I think very similar issues will be faced in Italy, in Spain, not just in France and the United Kingdom. You are right to say that the President Macron in particular, but also the Prime Minister of the UK currently are under very difficult internal political alignments or misalignments. So it is more difficult for them, that is clear. I think more we go towards Central and Eastern Europe, more the situation changes a bit, because if you look, for instance, at Poland, probably Poland will be in a situation in which such commitments will be easier to make, given its proximity to Ukraine, given its already high involvement in being in a frontliner of defense and of assistance to Ukraine, and also given its clear interests in the region where it is and its vicinity to Belarus and to Russia. So I think in some cases it will be easier, indeed. I do not think that it will be particularly difficult to ensure those commitments in the near future, i.e. in the next probably year or so. Why? Because in the next year we do not have foreseen elections in France, and President Macron is at his last possible presidential mandate. By the French constitution, the power to engage in a foreign territory, the power to engage militarily, France belongs to the president. So the president doesn't have a lot to lose and has just a year and a half into his current mandate. So over the short period of time, I don't see a big problem. Same from the UK probably. But over the medium term, that may indeed be a more difficult problem to solve.
Now, Vlad, the support from Washington for the guarantees, in a sense, I suppose, strengthens Europe's hand, doesn't it? But do you think it might also be a worry? It might almost deepen the EU's dependence on Washington in some sense.
I think you can see it both ways. So in a way, you can see that militarily, yes, there is currently a dependence of the EU on the US. I think the EU becomes more and more aware, more and more willing to actually have a standalone military power of its own for a number of reasons, and one has definitely to do with the current US administration and its actions in the recent weeks and days. So I think that is clearly pushing the EU more and more towards building its own military force. At the same time, I think if you look at the plan involves quite a lot of EU forces on the ground, and it involves a US security guarantee and a US surveillance general mission. So I think the role of the US in that configuration is definitely not the primary role, especially not on the ground in Ukraine. But of course, it is a supportive role and a supporting role, which I think is in line with what the US has committed itself to under President Trump when they have signed the agreements with the Ukraine. Let's remind ourselves of the agreements signed about exploitation of certain resources of Ukraine. So clearly there was a security commitment attached to the evolution of those agreements. So I don't think that the US has a disproportionate or very difficult role to assume there. I think the EU does assume much more, EU plus UK, of course, does assume much more of that role. It will remain to be seen if the US will be present in real terms if a deal is actually made, and if we face a situation where this commitment could be executed, i.e. we find a peace agreement in between Ukraine and Russia.
Now, we were talking earlier with the military strategist Chip Chapman about the extent to which Vladimir Putin would or wouldn't accept Western troops of any kind in Ukraine. If Moscow rejects the troops outright, what is the EU's next move then?
That is an extremely good question and difficult question at a point in time. I think if Russia would reject that, given now that the US has actually endorsed the plan, it will be a rejection not just to the EU, but to the EU and to the US. We know that President Trump is actually quite decisive and quite fast-changing opinions. So in this case, probably it's not the best course of action if Russia would not want to face basically the US and the EU. The EU is already facing that situation, that crisis situation. The US less so under President Trump, but it may so if a straight rejection is there. As the EU, the answer I think will need to there will need to be an answer. But what is the best answer? That is a very, very difficult thing to know. Why? Because the EU still maintains a stance on finding a peaceful agreement in this conflict in between Ukraine and Russia, and at the same time, no military commitment of the EU is not credible in terms of having Russia respect its obligations in a deal in Ukraine. So I don't think that they will accept anything else than a guarantee.
And then finally, I just wanted to go back to the point you made earlier about
Yes, I do hear you.
The extent to which the electorate, the citizens in countries like France and the UK will accept long-term financial commitment to supporting this security guarantees and an extensive backing of Ukraine. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? In France, there is all sorts of issues with competition, as we've seen across the EU. Very difficult for business to really get going. The UK is predicted to have very, very sluggish increases in economic growth, 1.4%, 1.5% at most in the next 2 to 4 years. I mean, isn't there a danger that whatever short-term commitments are made now, that at some point a future government is going to have to give in to the pressure and actually undo what's been agreed?
I think indeed, I think that there is always a risk that something like that would happen. At the same time, it is very difficult to undo what was agreed in terms of money spent, because the money will be spent very fast indeed. It is possible to undo what was agreed in terms of military support and in terms of military presence, of course, always. And that will depend indeed of the internal situation. I think the UK is in a different situation than France is, for the simple reason that it seems that the EU is going to finance this whole operation via a commonly agreed mechanism. So that for France or for the French citizen or taxpayer, that will be less visible or less directly visible.
Is that
so
more,
probably for
is,
France?
Forgive me, Vlad. Is that
yeah.
not a touch cynical? Is you know, Mr. Starmer and Monsieur Macron, are they thinking, as you've just said, quick? Let's get the money spent quickly, so that if the taxpayer disagrees, well, you know, they won't have a chance to claw it back.
I think the general discussion probably was what is needed and how much each of them can contribute. I think they both realize one thing, that if Ukraine is stabilized, whatever the cost of that would be, it is probably going to be much, much lower than any cost of direct confrontation with Russia. I think from that perspective, they are trying to actually find a solution which is feasible, reasonable, and which comes to a price tag which is acceptable. Now, of course, on the other hand, if you look from the taxpayer perspective, it's paying something that was not paid before. So it's always money which is going out, and they will not necessarily see the benefits of, by that money being spent, avoiding much larger expenses if the situation is not stabilized. And if the situation starts coming in the EU or nearer to the EU than it is already. So from that perspective, I think, yes, of course, they are trying to find a solution. It is not easy, for sure. I think they are making the best of the political timing that I mentioned. So they really want to have a solution probably fast. It will depend. It will depend on Russia, and I think it will depend a lot on the United States and on how the US administration would take a no from Russia. Let's see if it will be a no from Russia or it will be a no but from Russia. So maybe we'll face the second rather than the first.
Very interesting indeed. Vlad Vrimino, EU policy expert from Brussels. We thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, after the break, we'll take a look at the hidden security risks that often emerge after ceasefires, from extremist networks to hybrid threats, and how they could test any fragile peace during the transition period. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Primetime. As diplomatic efforts focus on ending the fighting, attention is shifting to what follows a ceasefire. Now, post-war environments often attract extremist networks, criminal actors, and hybrid threats. And with foreign troops and new security guarantees on the table, questions now centre on how risks are identified, managed, and prevented from undermining any fragile peace during the uncertain transition period ahead. Joining me now to discuss this is Ajmal Sahel, a counter-terrorism and national security analyst in Berlin, Germany. And Mr. Sahel, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You've obviously studied this extensively, many cases over the years. From a counter-terrorism perspective then, is there a typical sequence that we see when a ceasefire sort of mutates into extremism and terrorism?
Thank you very much for having me. So historically, if you see like situation in the Middle East and back in Iraq or even in Afghanistan, when the war or the conflict was over, that turned to be a hotbed for hatching a lot of terrorist or extremist organizations to hatch. So if you compare a situation, as I said before, the Iraq, so after the conflict between the United States and also the Saddam regime, and after the conflict, you see that it made it possible for the birth of the Islamic State. So this environment creates a situation that a number of the organizations are trying to use the situation to engage in a new sort of a conflict. Actually, the post-conflict environment is actually the situation where the fighters from the both sides, they start to disengage. But it is hard to monitor when there is not a specific monitor that what they are doing it. Then it provides a situation that there would be a lot of grievance within the society to provide security or to provide social services. Or there are a lot of things that the governments, even the strong governments, they leave some blind spots, and these blind spots on these grievances is an environment actually for the extremist organizations to use them and materialize for their narrative. And this is the situation. I don't say that that would happen to Ukraine as well, or I cannot. I don't want to say that the Ukraine state would be a failed one, but even the established states, they leave some blind spots, and these blind spots could be used by the extremist organizations.
And typically, what do we see? Is the greater percentage of activity simply just opportunism that emerges, or are there militant groups now looking at conflicts like this, perceiving that a ceasefire may happen, and properly, strategically planning how they might exploit the situation?
What I would like to tell is that we have, for example, two types of the extremist organizations. One are ideological and the other are tactical. So these tactical, my fear is for the tactical, or terrorist or extremist organizations, because these tactical extremist organizations would be used as a statecraft, like countries that they want to fail the ceasefire, they want to fail the post-conflict situation. They're going to try to use as a part of their narrative to exploit the situation and use these as a part of their statecraft. It happened. We saw them in Syria, we saw them in Iraq, even in some African countries. Some of the specific countries, so I don't want to mention the specific names of that, but they used the asymmetric system, because in the conflict, during the conflict, we have symmetric system or we have conventional war system. When the conflict is over, then these states, they're trying to use the asymmetric system so that there should be a plausible deniability. What happens, for example, we have on one side we have the United States, then we have Europe, and then of course Ukraine, and the other sides we have China, we have Iran, and then Russia. In this environment, each side, or probably at the most the Russian, they will try how to use or how to exploit the extremist organizations as a statecraft. At the end, there would be a plausible deniability and their hands would be clean.
And how, in cases like that, I mean, I think for many people watching this, they'll be fascinated that we're almost moving into the realm of sort of movies with some of these, interactions. If a state actor wanted to deploy that strategy, what is the mechanism? What is the transaction? Is it a direct one? Do groups appear like companies, and are millions of dollars wired to the group in return for their activity, or is there some more covert exchange of value in order to pay them for what they're about to do?
There would be a number of them. As I said before, there would be international terrorist organizations are interested in conflict. One of the research has shown that when the conflict in one country is over, they are moving to another country, and they're looking for conflict. And the situation will provide also the opportunity for some of the criminals that they would like, when there is disengagement and there are plenty of military grade weaponry left or not monitored, and this will provide a situation so they will smuggle these weaponries to sell them in a black market, or even bring them to Europe, and then it may be a situation to provide a situation, provide a conflict or organized criminality, to promote organized criminality even in European countries. We will see the situation that is coming if there wouldn't be a real monitoring opportunity in the country. And of course, as I said, the other part is like the countries that they are using as a statecraft. And of course, there would be cheaper. That would, if there would be like a symmetric warfare. So the state needs to mobilize a lot of troops and a lot of engagement. So when they are turning to the asymmetric, the less money would be used, and the greater job would be done through the organizations, to the criminal groups, or to the tactical extremist organizations. They are doing their jobs on behalf of the specific country, and down the road there would be a plausible deniability.
So a very real value chain then, in a sense, just like we get in business. There'll be a government, possibly an intelligence agency, possibly another intermediary, and then a terrorist organization. So it really, in a sense, it does work like we see in the movies.
Yeah, actually, the issue is if still, as we are now discussing, that the British would be in Ukraine, and also the French would be in Ukraine. Their presence would be more like a force of deterrence. They will not provide the specific stability. They will not turn the country to the stable situation. In this environment, and also if there would be like opportunity for intelligence sharing, there are a bunch of the data, but the important thing is the real-time intelligence sharing. The experience has shown back in Afghanistan or Iraq. So in Afghanistan, there were Americans, Canadians, or British or French. They were operating under the umbrella of NATO, but in a real time they were unable, or they didn't want really to share the real time intelligence, and this gap made it for the terrorist organizations to operate widely, and then at the end they depleted the international community, on the top the US, to leave the country. This situation may or may not happen in Ukraine as well.
If we look ahead at the possible future scenarios, obviously we can't know for sure what's going to happen, but we can see some possible key points. The troops, the European troops, putting their boots on the ground in Ukraine, potentially Moscow refusing to let that happen. When you look at these future scenarios that may occur over the next 12, 24 months, where do you think the biggest vulnerabilities lie? Where are those trigger points that we need to be especially vigilant around?
So, I mean, the Russian fear is, however, they tried for the past couple of years to stop entering Ukraine, be part of the NATO. That was the main objectives of the Russians to stop the Ukraine to be part of the NATO. But presence of the French and British is a sort of, as I said before, is a sort of a deterrence. So the Russians now may think or reconsider their presence will not make it possible for Russia to engage in full-scale war as we have it today. And there wouldn't be a possibility for a conventional war because the two NATO member states are there. However, they will not be engaged in a how can I say, in a battle zone against the Russian. But still, their presence is a sort of like assurance for the Ukraine that any attacks, anything could happen. It means it will trigger the NATO, and then immediately there would be like Article 5 of the NATO would be in practice. So the Russians will avoid in a conflict, a conventional conflict, and then they turn to the asymmetric, the hybrid conflict, which down the road that they will benefit from that. So the future, as I said, the most possible scenario for the future of Ukraine would be, of course, that is a ceasefire, that would be like a situation in transition. But this transition will also make possible for international terrorist organizations and also extremist organizations, also the countries, they would like to use the terrorist organization as a statecraft to promote their narrative.
And finally, Mr. Sahel, in terms of the type of terrorism, the risk of different types of terrorism, what do you think is the biggest risk? Is it a lone actor? Is it insurgency? Or is it some kind of hybrid threat along the lines of what you've described?
For insurgency, that the terrorist organizations, they don't have a specific, how can I say, territory, to be honest. So if you look back to the Al Qaeda or any terrorist organization, they don't have a specific territory to operate. So for insurgency, when you start an insurgency, you need to have a specific territory. So I don't think so that the future Ukraine would make it possible for an insurgent group to operate, because they need a territory, and then by providing a watchdog from the European community and also the United States, that would not be possible. But the only thing that may happen is the terrorists, they operating totally secretly, and also, as you said, the self-recruited, and also the one man or a lone wolf. That is more to happen. As I said, most of the states, when they are depleted and they are fatigued with the conflict for years, and then they leave a lot of blind spots, and these blind spots would be used by these terrorist organizations to target soft military targets, or maybe beside that, some of the areas which are belonging to the public, like there would be electricity grid, or any soft and possible area which make it for the terrorist organizations or the self-recruited or for the lone wolf to attack.
Mr. Sahel, we thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us and for joining us from Berlin. Thank you.
You're welcome.
After the break, we'll take a look at the top business news stories of the day with Andy Mioch. Do stay with us. A warm welcome back to Primetime. Andy Mioch is here with the business. Andy, welcome. What have you got on the agenda for us tonight?
Well, Guy, a new Venezuela deal that Washington announced sent oil prices down across the globe. We'll be also taking a look at some AI collaboration news, and there's a new chapter in the Netflix versus Paramount saga. So without further ado, first up, global oil prices have fallen by more than 1% after US President Donald Trump said Venezuela would hand over 30 to 50 million barrels of the country's blockaded crude to the United States. Venezuela's main oil buyer, China, has denounced the US for, as they put it, bullying.
Global oil prices fell on Wednesday, and China denounced the US as a bully after President Donald Trump's administration said it had persuaded Venezuela to divert supplies from Beijing and import up to $2 billion worth of sanctioned crude. The agreement announced by Trump on Tuesday would also help Venezuela avoid deeper oil production cuts. The deal is a strong sign that the Venezuelan government is responding to Trump's demand that they open up to US oil companies or risk more military intervention. Trump has said he wants interim President Delcy Rodriguez to give the US and private companies total access to Venezuela's oil industry. Venezuela has millions of barrels of oil loaded on tankers and in storage tanks that it has been unable to ship due to a blockade on exports imposed by Trump since mid-December. The blockade was part of rising US pressure on the government of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro that culminated in US forces capturing him over the weekend. Top Venezuelan officials have called Maduro's capture a kidnapping and accused the US of trying to steal the country's vast oil reserves. Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to the US, Trump said in a social media post. Crude prices fell around 1% on world markets due to anticipated increased supplies.
China has implemented an immediate ban on the export of dual-use goods to Japan that could be used for military purposes. This is the latest escalation in the Tokyo-Beijing tensions over Taiwan, remarks made by the Japanese Prime Minister back in November.
China has banned exports of dual-use items to Japan that can be used for military purposes, according to a Commerce Ministry statement on Tuesday. This is Beijing's latest move in reaction to an early November remark by Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi about Taiwan. Dual-use items are goods, software or technologies that have both civilian and military applications, including certain rare earth elements that are essential for making drones and chips. Exports of such items to military users or for any purposes that contribute to Japan's military strength are banned, effective immediately, the statement said, adding that organizations or individuals from any country or region that violated the ban would be held legally liable. Japan's foreign ministry said it strongly protested the measures and demanded that China withdraw them. It called the move absolutely unacceptable and deeply regrettable. It said the measures targeted only Japan and that they deviate significantly from international practice.
Now for some news from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Lenovo announced a partnership with NVIDIA targeting faster AI infrastructure rollouts. The plan is to help AI cloud providers reduce deployment time from months to weeks.
New networking switches.
China's Lenovo, the world's largest personal computer maker, on Tuesday said it has teamed up with US AI chip leader NVIDIA to help AI cloud providers quickly put data centers into operation as it strives to establish itself in AI. The technology company, which also makes servers, made the announcement at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, while also showcasing an AI platform, concept devices, and the first foldable smartphone under its Motorola brand. Under the data center program, Lenovo said it will offer its liquid-cooled hybrid AI infrastructure alongside NVIDIA's computing platforms to help AI cloud providers reduce deployment time to weeks. Lenovo CEO Yang Yuanqing also unveiled Kira, a personal AI system designed to work across Lenovo and Motorola PCs, phones, tablets, and wearables, even in the background. The system would also be able to provide services from the likes of travel company Expedia, Lenovo said.
Another possible NVIDIA tie-up has sent Hyundai's shares soaring nearly 15%. The speculation about a deeper partnership is in part fueled by the debut of Hyundai Boston Dynamics' next-generation humanoid robot at the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas.
Shares of Hyundai Motor rallied on Wednesday by almost 15% to hit a record high in morning trade, outperforming the benchmark Kospi's 1.2% gain amid market speculation about a potential deeper tie-up with NVIDIA. Hyundai's Boston Dynamics debuted its next-generation Atlas humanoid robot at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas on Monday. However, an analyst at Kiwoom Securities said Hyundai's announcement about the planned deployment in its factories of Atlas humanoid robots made at CES was insufficient to fully explain the rally. He noted that robot production is planned at around 30,000 units by 2028 and that the Atlas product was showcased only as a static mock-up display. Nevertheless, he said investor expectations appeared to be rising that Hyundai Motor Group's partnership with NVIDIA could extend beyond a simple chip supply relationship, following a meeting between Hyundai Motor Group Chair Yuisun Chung and NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang at CES. During his first official visit in more than a decade to South Korea last October, Huang met South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, Chung and other business leaders on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Gyeongju, highlighting the company's deepening ties with its tech and auto industries.
A software glitch affecting rear-view cameras prompted Volkswagen and its subsidiary Porsche to recall more than 500,000 vehicles in the United States. This marks one of the largest safety recalls for Porsche in recent years.
Problems with the rearview mirror have forced Porsche and now parent company Volkswagen to recall over 500,000 vehicles collectively in the US. The US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration announced the latest round of measures on Tuesday. Volkswagen Group of America, including its Audi subsidiary, is recalling over 356,000 vehicles in the country. The NHTSA said it's due to a software error that can lead to problems displaying the rearview camera image. Volkswagen recorded annual sales in the US market of almost 380,000 units in 2024 and almost 330,000 in 2023. It did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Last week, the German auto group's luxury subsidiary Porsche said it would recall over 173,000 vehicles in the US, also due to a rear-view camera problem. It's one of the largest single safety recalls issued by Porsche Cars North America in recent years. The agency said the Volkswagen recall affects certain models from 2019 to 2026, with dealers to update the software free of charge.
And finally, in the world of media, Warner Brothers Discovery has once again chosen Netflix as its preferred suitor over Paramount. The company's board advised shareholders to reject Paramount's revised takeover bid, labeling it inadequate and too risky compared to their existing deal with Netflix.
Warner Brothers Discovery's board on Wednesday advised shareholders that last month's revised offer from Paramount is still not as appealing as the existing agreement with Netflix. The board called Paramount's hostile takeover offer inadequate and overly risky. In a letter to shareholders, the board linked Paramount's proposal to a leveraged buyout, a financial process that relies on using mostly borrowed funds to buy a company. Paramount is much smaller than WBD, so to effect the transaction, it intends to incur an extraordinary amount of incremental debt, more than $50 billion, through arrangements with multiple financing partners, the WBD letter stated. This structure poses risk for the whole takeover plan to fall apart, compared with the certainty of the Netflix merger, the letter added. Paramount has sought to alleviate concerns about the financing by pointing to the fact that one of the world's richest people, Oracle billionaire Larry Ellison, is bankrolling much of the proposed takeover. His son David Ellison, the CEO of Paramount, triggered a bidding war for WBD last year by making an unsolicited bid for the assets. WBD, led by CEO David Zaslav, then ran an auction process and accepted Netflix's offer of $27.75 per share for Warner Brothers and HBO, with $23.25 in cash and the rest in Netflix stock. Paramount offered $30 per share and went public with that offer after it was spurned by the WBD board. But the board continues to insist that Paramount's proposal is inferior. Along with concerns about debt financing, WBD has cited the potential value of its cable assets, which Netflix is not acquiring. WBD's cable channels, including CNN, are being broken off into a new, publicly traded company called Discovery Global later this year. The Warner board has argued that Discovery Global will have significant value on its own, while Paramount has valued it at just $1 per share.
That is all in tonight's business brief. Well, Guy, I guess we'll have to wait and see whether the Warner Brothers shareholders will accept the advice and take up that Netflix merger and chill offer.
Very interesting. Yes, very interesting indeed. We'll have to wait and see. Andy, thank you very much indeed. Okay, after the break, we'll take a look at rising tensions in Armenia as Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan moves to challenge church leaders. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching PrimeTime. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has taken steps toward removing Catholicos Garagan II, the head of the Armenian Apostolic Church, according to local media. Now, Pashinyan met with 10 senior clergymen at his official residence, where they signed a statement outlining a roadmap for what they described as reforming church leadership. The statement criticised the church's leadership for moral failings, political involvement, arbitrary governance and internal divisions. The signatories said the process aims to revive the church and strengthen its spiritual role. Well, Pashinyan and the clergymen also announced the formation of a coordinating council to oversee the reform process. Well, joining me now in the studio to discuss this is Orkan Amashov, our regional expert. Of course, Orkan, great to see you.
Great to be here.
As always. Very interesting story this, isn't it? Is this very significant, do you think, that a sitting Armenian prime minister is openly challenging church leaders like this?
I suppose, Guy, the story on its own is not as significant as it may appear, but as part of the wider process, it's incredibly significant. There has been church-government confrontation in Armenia probably since 2020. And this is a very important moment. What happened is that sitting Prime Minister, incumbent Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, is effectively considering the head of the church, Armenian Apostolic Church, Gagarin II, as a dangerous man. He wants to get rid of him. It's a power struggle, basically. And to understand what is happening, we need to appreciate what Prime Minister Pashinyan is trying to do. Well, allow me to go back to 2020, with your permission. For us to be able to understand what's happening, we need to go back to 2020. Even back to 2018, when Prime Minister Pashinyan came to power, became Prime Minister in 2018, their relations, I suppose, were functional. They were not particularly liking each other. There was no great chemistry or affinity, but the relations were functional from 2018 to 2020. After the Second Karabakh War, where Armenia was defeated by Azerbaijan, Gagarin II, the head of the Armenian Apostolic Church, called on Pashinyan to resign after the war. So that's a very clear moment. And then continuously opposed everything that Pashinyan has been trying to do up until now. He was effectively accusing Pashinyan of betraying Armenian people, effectively instilling revenge sentiments in society, describing Pashinyan as a traitor of the highest order. And in 2021, when there was a snapper parliamentary elections in Armenia, he was firmly on the side of the opposition, and he still is, of course, it goes without saying. He's a politically connected person. And later, in 2024, in April, when Azerbaijan and Armenia agreed on delimiting and demarcating 12.4-kilometer section of the interstate border, Bagrat Galstanyan, Archbishop, who is naturally closely connected with the church, being Archbishop, and particularly with the head of the church, Gagarin II, organized protests against this peace process. And in summer 2025, Pashinyan himself actively attacked the church and its leader, calling on him to resign and so forth. So this is an ongoing political battle. Church is against everything that Pashinyan is doing, from Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process to Turkish-Armenian normalization.
And why so, Orkan? I mean, understand that people don't like each other sometimes. They're politically, ideologically opposed. We can understand that. But this sounds like it's more than just two men not liking each other. What's driving Gagarin II for this consistent opposition to Pashinyan?
I suppose we need to understand what the Armenian Church is all about in the first place. It is a very powerful institution. It is an autonomous power center within Armenia. According to Armenian constitution, according to Article 17 of Armenian constitution, state and church, those two notions are separate. Church-state separation exists in Armenia, but Article 18 also states that Armenian Apostolic Church has got exclusive mission in the context of preservation of Armenian culture, Armenian national identity, and also Armenian Church is effectively responsible for effectively controlling the spiritual life of the country, taking care of the spiritual life. It is not a state institution. Gagarin II is not a state appointee, state official. It is more or less, it is more like a state within a state, very state-like institution without being a state institution with an exclusive mission. And the church is fundamentally and wholeheartedly against peace with Azerbaijan, because church's vision, and church is very much linked with the Armenian diaspora, is effectively based on this survival identity. In a sense, I suppose, with all due respect to Armenian Apostolic Church, it would be fair to say, connected with this victimhood mentality, events of 1915, the impossibility of coexistence with Azerbaijan and Armenia, close ties with Russia. All of those elements, if you see those elements as part of the identity which shapes Armenian Apostolic Church, it wouldn't be too difficult to understand why they are not getting along well. He is very powerful, and Pashinyan needs to get rid of him. Pashinyan has been arguing that the Gagarin II had broken celibacy vow and fathered a son, which goes against the fundamental canons of any clergyman, well, upper-class clergyman at least. And this is one part of the story. The political battle is underway between those two figures. And also church is supporting Armenian opposition which is widely connected with Russia, or rather believed to be connected with Russia, and also Gagarin II has been firmly supporting the jailed Armenian tycoon of Russian connections and Russian citizens, Karapetyan, as well. Two different Armenians, basically. I mean, I interviewed a number of prominent Armenian analysts about the subject, and this is connected with Azerbaijan and peace. There are two different Armenias. One Armenia, and church is espousing that Armenia, which lives in the past, which lives with a vision of creating what one may call a greater Armenia, which is not realistic, which keeps you in the past without depriving you of the opportunity to dream of a brighter future. And there's a second Armenia, which is more realistic Armenia, and Pashinyan calls it real Armenia, which believes that Armenia is a sovereign country, and a power center should be the political institution elected, the prime minister, the leader of the elected party.
How likely is it, Orkan, in your analysis, that this coordinated, to some degree, campaign to undermine, ultimately get rid of Nikol Pashinyan, how likely is it that that will work, and what risks does that pose, therefore, not just to Armenia, but to the wider region, and particularly the peace process?
For peace process to succeed, Pashinyan needs to consolidate his power internally. Internal consolidation means, amongst many other things, weakening the position of the current leader of the Armenian church. May it backfire? That was the crux of your question. It may potentially. There are some constitutional problems with this. It is a matter of constitutional, political and ecclesiastical nature. Church is separate from the government. And Pashinyan created this coordinating council which needs to oversee the church reform plus effectively unsitting of the current head of the church. Can a coordinating council endorsed by the government, which is not an ecclesiastical body, unseat the head of the church? Constitutionally, it does not look very kosher, it does not look right. But the question here is that ambition is lofty and noble, but another question is that can Armenia, for the sake of achieving noblest of aims, which is signing the peace deal with Azerbaijan, having a bright future, do something which is not particularly constitutional? It's a fundamental question. There's no clear answer to this question, but I think he will take certain drastic steps prior to the June election, which he has to win, and perhaps, I'm not entirely sure, this issue related to Armenian Apostolic Church could be part of the constitutional reform as well.
It's very interesting. I mean, we know that a wide range of different views exist in Armenia, as in any society. We've been lucky enough to interview many members of the public here at A News in Yerevan and ask their views on a wide range of issues. There is, though, an alternative vision, isn't there, that's being presented, an opportunity which has been created now for younger people, for business leaders, for entrepreneurs, to really create prosperity, long-term prosperity, out of this peace process. Is it likely that citizens in Azerbaijan will be swayed by this sort of slightly sort of regressive vision, taking them back to the past?
This is a very, very important question. People in Azerbaijan, analysts in particular, are keeping a beady eye on what's happening in Armenia. And they fundamentally see in that internal battle of Armenia, we are fully conscious Armenia's internal matter, it's up to them. There's absolutely no intention to interfere with their internal affairs. But when Armenia's internal affairs, when that section of that relationship is connected with Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process, it ceases to be internal Armenian matter, becomes a bilateral regional matter. Basically, the reality is that the Armenian society probably, not in its preponderant majority, but in reasonable majority, supports Prime Minister Pashinyan's reforms. But the problem with Pashinyan is that his ratings are no longer going up. He's actually facing a massive challenge. There is a not preponderant, but sizable section of Armenian society which is undecided. And their approach to the reforms regarding the church may potentially prove to be decisive. You've got Prime Minister Pashinyan supporters. You've got people who do not like him, who want him to be deposed. Pashinyan is effectively prevailing over opposition. But there is I would say 35% of Armenian society which is undecided. And they do not trust Pashinyan, but their hatred and dislike towards opposition, and by opposition we understand the supporters of former presidents Kocharian, Sarkisian, their hatred is so massive, is so overwhelming that they, whilst choosing between two candidates, they prefer lesser evil. And for them, Pashinyan is not a perfect choice, but worse than the opposition. And there's no clear answer to what extent Pashinyan will be able to succeed in terms of reforms. Many analysts say that June parliamentary elections may result in Pashinyan, and probably will result in Pashinyan, achieving his objective, but will there be violence? Many people are worried about violence, and violence is not at all outside the realm of possibility. And after winning potentially these elections, will Pashinyan will be able to institute the reform agenda properly and put it into practice? And perhaps church issue will come there. Armenia is in transition. Armenia's internal dynamics, of which we are conscious and in relation to which we're making our analysis, are inextricably connected to Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process. Because when you look back at when Garagin II first criticized Pashinyan, it was after the war. Because in the eyes of the church establishment, clergy, Pashinyan is a man who betrayed Armenia, the nation. In their understanding, he lost Karabakh, because his reforms were not very successful, and he needs to be removed. And Pashinyan is effectively saying that Karabakh was lost prior to my ascendance to power, he says. He says that the previous government failed miserably in terms of military reforms, and Pashinyan, not instantly back in 2018, but eventually acknowledged that Karabakh is an Azerbaijani sovereign territory, and actually tying your ambitions to the illegal occupation was a wrong policy from the very beginning. And he's saying that, do not blame me for what happened in Karabakh. My predecessors were to be blamed. I merely tried to save the situation and I failed. Not because I was a failure, because the failure prior to me was so massive that I wasn't able to rectify anything. Something very fascinating happening in Armenia. Of course, it's up to Armenian population to decide, but it is inextricably connected with Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process. Therefore, we should also keep a beady eye on what's happening there.
So this intense pressure coming from the church and others on Prime Minister Pashinyan, what about support? What support exists for him, his reformist agenda, not just from within his own party, but from other organisations, other parties across the country?
But naturally, Azerbaijan and Armenia, in terms of peace process, act in line, in close coordination. Economic cooperation between Azerbaijan and Armenia probably will help Pashinyan in terms of his internal dynamics. But in terms of the actors, naturally the EU, amongst the external actors, is hugely supportive of Prime Minister Pashinyan. And even for the sake of ensuring his victory, they are happy to turn a blind eye to some of the irregularities that may happen there in the context of the conduct of the government, the law enforcement agencies, and they are hell-bent on ensuring Prime Minister Pashinyan's victory. And quite often what happens is, we fully understand that the opposition is they're not angelic creatures there, but for the sake of making Pashinyan look plausible, positive, future-oriented, slight artificial and elaborate demonization of the opposition is also taking place, and EU supports this process. It is an important juncture. It is a revolutionary moment for the region. And at this juncture, many actors, whatever normative thinking may guide them under normal circumstances, when too much at stake, the means to achieve the objective are being viewed from a different angle. And some of the methods which would have been abnormal and completely unacceptable under normal circumstances are being deemed as perfectly plausible and worthy of pursuing. Pashinyan has got strong support from Brussels, and all this conversation regarding Armenia joining the European Union, in my humble opinion, is completely artificial, because Armenia, economically, geopolitically, nowhere near joining European Union. Nobody in European Union, if you talk to European policymakers, all of them are saying it's all about making Pashinyan look plausible, giving him that credence, that support, helping him to institute and carry out all of those reforms. But EU ambition is a mere ambition. It will not be fulfilled at any point very soon. It may happen at some point in the fullness of time, but not very soon. The United States naturally supports Prime Minister Pashinyan, and Azerbaijan, in the context of Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process, support the peace process, and supporting peace process inevitably means indirect support for Prime Minister Pashinyan.
Very interesting indeed. Orkan, we thank you very much, as always.
Always great pleasure and great privilege. Thank you.
After the break, we'll take a look at how sport is being pulled into US political debate after President Donald Trump's remarks on transgender athletes have raised questions over accuracy, evidence and the impact on those named. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Turning to sport now, and US President Donald Trump has mocked transgender athletes in an address to Republican lawmakers on Tuesday. He gave examples of weightlifting and mentioned Algerian boxer Iman Khalif's 2024 Summer Olympics fight in Paris. Now, we must note that no medical evidence has been published to confirm she is transgender or has XY chromosomes. Here's what Trump had to say.
Or the beautiful boxer, they have boxing now, and that they have a young gentleman who transitioned, who's a very good boxer, but he wanted to be a woman, which is, to each his own. Because I want to be very liberal when it comes to these subjects. I'm trying to get that vote. It's not an easy vote to get. It's very tough for me to get it. But he transitioned, and he transitioned. And the girl was a champion boxer from Italy, remember? She got up, first round. He hit her, boom, with a left. A left, for those, everybody here knows about, but a left, Lisa knows better than anybody. But a left is defense. He goes, boom. She's like, oh my. She walked to the corner, remember? She didn't go down, but she did everything else. But she said, I've never been hit like that before. I don't want to go out again. You can do it. You can do it. Bang. She walked off. She said, he happened to win the gold medal, that young woman. He won the gold medal. There were two transition people. They both won gold medals. The whole thing is ridiculous.
Pretty extraordinary stuff. Okay, joining me now in the studio is A News' Katie Wilson to break down all this and what it all means. Katie, good to see you. Let's just get into it in detail then. What exactly did President Trump say, and how has the reaction been so far?
Yes, as you just heard in that clip there, Trump claimed that two transition people won gold medals in boxing. Now, more than likely he's referring to the Olympic gold medalist Iman Khalif and Lin Yuting, and they were subject to gender-related scrutiny during the Paris Olympics back in 2024. Now, neither Khalif nor Lin transitioned. As the International Olympic Committee pointed out, both competitors were identified as female at birth and have always competed as women. Now, where that scrutiny has come from was essentially that a boxing authority with extensive ties to the Russian government and a history of corruption, they disqualified Khalif and Lin from a 2023 competition, claiming they'd failed a gender eligibility test. So that's where this all came from, but they never substantiated that assertion, and regardless, it was never claimed anyway that they transitioned, which was what Trump was saying. So it's yet another remark from Trump that's not quite factually accurate, but of course it was headline grabbing, and it was part of a wider conversation about transgender athletes in women's sport. Now, the internet reacted to Trump doing an impression of a transgender athlete participating in weightlifting. And he did that during that same speech, and he was essentially urging Republicans to campaign in the midterms this year on this priority of opposing transgender athletes competing in women's sport. So he pretended to be a woman lifting weights, struggling to make a lift, and then began to imitate another athlete who could easily lift the weight, who was supposedly a transgender athlete. And the internet was quick to react to all of this. One critic of Trump is saying that he's mimicking women weightlifting, talking about transitioning women boxing, but isn't there something more important to talk about? And others are praising the president's remarks, such as sports people who advocate against transgender athletes competing in women's sports. So of course it's a contentious debate that Trump is certainly playing into.
He's been very effective though, President Trump, hasn't he, over the years at playing strongly to his core supports. I guess he's also doing that here. How do these comments fit into that wider strategy, do you think?
Yeah, so this is one of the most debated issues in modern sport. It's one of the most contentious issues as well. It's that debate between inclusivity and fairness. And for a number of years, this has dominated conversations about competitive sport. Critics argue that biological differences in strength and endurance may give some transgender women an advantage. And even after hormone therapy, there still could be differences in muscle mass, strength, and cardiovascular capabilities. But supporters of transgender athletes being included in women's sports, they point to governing bodies' regulations, which often require hormone levels to be within certain ranges anyway. In actually real-world cases of transgender competitors at the highest levels are extremely rare. And the people that this is most likely to impact is transgender athletes in community sport. And major sporting bodies, they have been revising their rules in recent years in response to these fairness concerns. So World Athletics, they banned transgender women who have undergone male puberty from competing in the women's category since 2023. World Aquatics, that's for swimming, they introduced policies that exclude transgender women from elite women's competition unless they transition before puberty, and they're looking at having an open category where transgender athletes can compete. Now, we are seeing this trickle down into community sports. So CrossFit Games, they reversed a previously trans-inclusive policy, and they now require competitors to participate in the division matching their sex assigned at birth. And currently in the Olympics, their framework is to leave it to individual sporting federations to decide their own criteria rather than having a uniform limit. So all of this reflects that broader tension where governing bodies are trying to balance competitive fairness with inclusion for transgender athletes. Now, this isn't the first time Trump has commented on this issue as well. Back in May, Trump suggested that athletes that fail in the male category go on to compete in the women's category as transgender women and break records. Now,
this is the sort of anecdotal stuff where they say, you know, he was 400th in the world as a man, and she's third in the world as a woman. Things like that.
Exactly. So this is something else that Trump has said this year, and that's never happened. There's no documented case of a transgender woman athlete breaking and keeping a women's world record. That's important. And there are high-profile transgender athletes such as Laurel Hubbard, who competed for New Zealand in women's Olympic weightlifting back in 2021 in those Tokyo Games. And she was the first openly transgender woman to compete in the Olympics, but she didn't set any world records.
Very interesting indeed. Where is the balance of the debate within sport now, Katie? I mean, I presume, like all contentious issues, that the people's consensus will shift. Where is it at the moment?
Yeah, so it is, as you say, it's an ongoing debate, but I think beyond elite sport, you've got the community levels, and and it's certainly trickling down into community sport. Now, in regards to weightlifting specifically, this is actually the fastest growing sport among women. This is traditionally a male-dominated sport, but over the past decade, women taking up weightlifting have increased by 150%, and more women are recognising the health benefits of weightlifting, but 38% more women than men say they're scared to lift weights for the fear of getting bulky. So old myths die hard is what people in the fitness industry would say. So we've got this climate where Trump is mimicking a female weightlifter for the sake of arguing against transgender inclusion in sport. And as you say, that's going to speak to that core MAGA voters that are against transgender inclusion. But the question is how that's going to go down with female voters who may well be taking up strength training amid this evolving fitness industry, and how that's going to reflect on the way they vote.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Have we had any sense yet of how women in particular have responded to some of these comments?
So women in the fitness industry are certainly against this, and they point to busting those myths in terms of making strength training a more inclusive space. Obviously, we see that with the increase of women's only gyms that focus on strength training, as well as the increase in, removing the cardio machines from women's gyms and adding in more weight. We're seeing an increase in that those weightlifting machines are getting added in. Now, one transgender cyclist has spoken out about this. So Trump singled her out for ruining women's sport. They were his words, and she said in an article responding to that comment that actually Trump hasn't done anything to elevate or fund or support female athletes. These policies that Trump are bringing in, he says they're to protect women in sport, but actually what they're doing, they're threatening to cut federal funding to schools or universities that include transgender competitors in sport. And as I say, more often than not, it's community sport that's affected by this rather than elite sport. And what I've seen from my research is that these executive orders have actually been used to withhold or threaten to withhold funding from schools or universities that allow transgender women to participate in women's sport. So Trump is saying he's doing this to protect women's sport. Trump also said that trans inclusive policies were demeaning to women, but bear in mind we did see a clip of Trump mimicking a female athlete failing to lift a weight and saying she drops the thing and walks off stage crying. So I'm sure it'll be up to public opinion there what is really demeaning to women in sport.
Very interesting indeed. Katie, as always, we thank you very much for your analysis. Thank you. Okay, after the break, we check in with our correspondents all around the world for the very latest developments from their regions. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Prime Time. Now let's head to our correspondents in their regions. And we start in Uzbekistan, where the country attracted a record $43.1 billion of investments in 2025, driven by strong foreign inflows and rising investor confidence, even as the country's external debt continued to grow. Our correspondent has more.
Uzbekistan secured $43.1 billion in total investment in 2025, marking a 24% increase compared with the previous year. The majority of the inflows came from foreign direct investment, which reached $38.2 billion, alongside $4.9 billion from international financial institutions. Major investing countries included China, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, with funds directed into infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, mining, agriculture, and services. At the same time, external financial indicators show mixed dynamics. Uzbekistan's total external debt exceeded $75 billion by October 2025, rising by more than $11 billion since the start of the year, largely due to increased borrowing by the corporate sector. Corporate external debt now slightly exceeds government borrowing. Despite this, macroeconomic balances improved. Exports grew by more than 30%. The current account deficit narrowed sharply, and international reserves rose to around $55 billion, supported by higher gold prices and strong foreign currency inflows. Officials say continued investment goals will remain a priority, while external borrowing will be closely monitored to maintain long-term financial stability. It is Civil Vajapov reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
Kazakhstan plans to complete a 380-kilometre subsea fibre optic cable to Azerbaijan by the end of 2026. Now, the project aims to boost internet traffic and improve data routes between Europe and Asia. Our correspondent Fariza Kalamazina reports now from Almaty.
Kazakhstan plans to complete the fiber optic cable across the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan by the end of 2026. The project was announced at a government meeting by Kazakhstan's Minister of Digital Development, Innovation and Aerospace Industry, Jaslan Madiev. He said work is already underway on an optical communications line that will be laid along the seabed, linking the two countries across the Caspian. The cable is expected to increase the amount of international internet traffic passing through Kazakhstan and make data routes between Europe and Asia more reliable. Work on the project began in August 2025. Kazakhstan's national telecom operator Kazakhtelecom and Azerbaijan's Azertelecom carried out marine survey operations to assess the route ahead of construction. The fiber optic line will stretch for about 380 kilometers, running between the Kazakh port city of Aktau and the Azerbaijani city of Sumgait. And once completed, it will become the first subsea optical cable in the Caspian Sea. Kazakhtelecom says the line will support data transmission speeds of up to 400 terabits per second. The project is also part of the Trans-Caspian Digital Corridor, which aims to diversify and strengthen digital connectivity across the region. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Iran has issued a sharp warning over what it calls growing hostile signals. Tehran says it may act before any attack takes place as tensions rise alongside ongoing domestic protests over the economy. Turaj Shiralilo has more from Tehran.
Iran's Defense Council warned in a statement on Tuesday of a preemptive action if it detects a hostile threat beyond rhetoric, saying that Tehran's response to a forthcoming threat will be significant. It is stressed that Iran does not see itself confined solely to reaction after an act has occurred and views objective indicators of threat as part of the security equation. The statement by the Secretariat of the newly formed Defense Council, which was established in the wake of the 12-day US-Israel war against Iran last June, was issued as Washington and Tel Aviv have recently drummed up their hostile rhetoric against Tehran. The strongly worded statement promising precautionary action if threats directed at Iran go beyond rhetoric raised the possibility of a preemptive measure by Tehran in anticipation of an approaching military attack. It stressed that escalation of threatening and interventionist rhetoric, which goes beyond verbal stance, can be understood as hostile behavior, a path that, if continued, will result in a proportionate and decisive response. The Defense Council's statement was issued as Iran is passing through the 11th day of protest to rising inflation. Earlier, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei said that protesters to economic woes and violent rioters will not be dealt similarly. Turaj Shiralilu, Tehran, A News.
Tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan are rising after a spell of relative calm. Pakistan's military has accused Kabul of allowing militant groups to operate from its territory, blaming them for recent attacks inside Pakistan. Afghanistan has firmly rejected the claims, calling them baseless and warning against any interference in its internal affairs.
These renewed tensions come after a period of relative calm between Islamabad and Kabul, but the war of words has now escalated sharply. At a press conference in Islamabad, Pakistan's military spokesperson Major General Ahmad Sharif Chaudhry accused Afghanistan of becoming the region's main center for terrorism in 2025. He claimed militant groups operating from Afghan soil are behind a surge in violence inside Pakistan, adding that Islamabad's concerns now have international backing. General Chaudhry said the Doha Agreement requires Afghan soil not to be used for terrorism, but claimed banned groups are now operating freely in Afghanistan, making it a center of regional militancy. In a rare and direct admission, the spokesperson also confirmed that Pakistani forces carried out strikes on what he described as terrorist positions across the border after repeated requests to the Taliban to curb militant activity went unanswered. But Kabul has hit back hard. Afghanistan's official spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid condemned Pakistan's accusation as irresponsible, provocative and baseless propaganda. In a statement posted on social media, Mujahid said the remarks were detached from reality and fell short of the standards expected from a professional military. He insisted Afghanistan is a stable and independent country with full control over its territory, and warned that any interference in its internal affairs, including what he called a threatening language, is unacceptable to the Afghan people. The Afghan authorities have urged Pakistan to focus on its own internal challenges instead of escalating tensions with what they described as unfounded claims. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
Well, that brings us to the end of Prime Time. Please do join us tomorrow evening for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here at A News, thanks for watching.